My name is Todd Lawrence, and I'd like to welcome you to this event, this hyper cyber event that's being sponsored by the Eastside Freedom Library. My name is Todd Lawrence. I'm faculty in the English department at the University of St. Thomas, but I'm also a board member at the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm here to talk to my friend Kanishka Chowdhury about his new book, or his recent book, Human Rights Discourse in the Post-9/11 Age. There you go. You can see the beautiful cover of that book. Dr. Chowdhury is faculty in the Department of English, and he at the University of St. Thomas, and he directs the American Culture and Difference program there. He's a cultural theorist, a political economist, a critical theorist, and a literary and film scholar, among other things. This is his second book. His first book, The New India, Citizenship, Subjectivity, and Economic Liberation, was published in 2011. And in addition to these books, he's published quite a number of articles in journals like South Asian Review, Cultural Logic, Cultural Critique, New Formations, and Counterpunch. And so this book, which was published this fall, offers an important intervention into the global context of human rights discourse, with specific focus on its quote, the absence of attention to economic questions. And so that's something that we're going to get to when we get to the conversation. So before we get started, let me say Dr. Chowdhury, who I'm going to refer to as Kanishka because we're friends for the rest of the time. You want to say anything before we get started asking and answering questions?
Thanks, Todd, and thanks a lot for this opportunity to speak with you about my book. And thanks particularly to the Eastside Freedom Library, whose work I so admire and whose work in the community is so important. This is a wonderful chance to engage about some of these very, very important issues during the present moment, particularly, with the hope that one day we can do this live in the lovely setting of the Eastside Freedom Library. So yeah, thanks a lot, Todd, for arranging this.
Yeah, and as Kanishka mentioned, our hope is that at some point in the future we'll be able to do this in person, and you can come and see Kanishka and I have this conversation in person. And there's so much to talk about with this book. We can't possibly cover everything in maybe the 45 minutes we're going to have today. So there'll be plenty of things that we didn't talk about that we can talk about at that time. But one of the things you'll be able to do is you'll be able to purchase the book, which he'll have for sale at that future event, and only $10, which is an extremely great price. And so we hope that that'll happen in the future. I have a lot of questions about the book, Kanishka, and I think it's a really timely book, and we'll get to maybe the very, very contemporary and present aspect of it later in the conversation. But first, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your notion of human rights. What do you mean when you say human rights discourse, and maybe why is it important to talk about human rights discourse at all?
Right. So yeah, this is obviously one of the foundational questions that inform the work in my book. So one of the things that I'll just say anecdotally, that when I was hadn't even started writing this book, I was thinking a lot about, who gets honored and named and who gets kind of held up as a sort of figurehead for human rights and human rights work. And one particular episode that happened, I believe it was in 2013, was, as you know, about that time, there were these boats that were going from North Africa to across the Mediterranean, trying to reach mainland Europe, full of war refugees from Syria and the Middle East and North Africa, Libya. And one of those boats, capsized, and hundreds of lives were lost during that time. And, there was the usual sort of hand-wringing from the sort of press, the Western press, talking about how awful this was and all of that. But there was no real recognition of, what was at stake here, that the fact that these people had to travel in this horribly dangerous way to find refuge why was this necessary? Why wasn't there a process by which they could legitimately and legally claim asylum, which they're entitled to do? At about the same time, there's this young Pakistani girl who you know, Malala Yousafzai, who was being honored for her incredible courage, and rightly so, for standing up to the Taliban and speaking up for freedom and all of that. And she was being given some prize, and I don't remember what prize it was, but she was being honored by, again, the West for the work she had done. And I thought, why this disparity? Why do we not see and honor the courage of the people who are trying to risk their lives in order to sort of move to a safer place? Why do we honor some people, and why do we ignore, dishonor, erase the lives of other people? And gradually, one of the things that I begin to examine and explore more carefully is that the language of human rights is set up in such a way that this is what happens. This is what it makes possible, that certain kinds of valor, courage, whatever you want to call it, is honored, and other kinds aren't. And if you really look closely at it, what it really comes out to is that there is a sort of an ignoring of the systemic problems from which some of these human rights problems arise. And those systemic problems are precisely what human rights language sometimes avoids mentioning, or avoids complicating, or ignores altogether. And so one thing I wanted to try to address in this book is, okay, so we see the necessity for human rights. There's no denying that there are a huge amount of human rights abuses, but is there something in the way we talk about rights? Is there something in the way we describe, quote unquote, the victims of abuses? Is there something in the way that all of these categorizations are made and solutions formulated? Does this affect the actual work that people do? Does it actually result in the sort of transformation that would prevent human rights abuses in the future? And so I started looking at the language, and what I found fascinating is how the language sort of tried to manage many of the catastrophes rather than solving them. It was more a way of saying, okay, we see this particular crisis at this particular moment, and this is what we're going to do about it. But there was no real sense of understanding the many systemic and structural problems behind these kinds of many injustices. So that's what really set me on the road to that. And then what I tried to do was to look at a variety of sources where these kinds of languages were used. So everything from works of literature to documentary films to NGO documents to manifestos, proclamations, and of course I started with the 1948 UN Human Rights Declaration, which is sort of the foundational manifesto, proclamation, call it what you will, for the modern age. And so I just started unpacking that language and seeing where it led us and what the implications are in the present if we kind of abide by the sort of norms set forth in that sort of discourse. So, to cut a long story short, I think the language really does determine how we look at the world, how we look at the injustices, and how we formulate the solutions for them.
Okay, so I'm gonna go right. We talked before we started, before we started recording, and I told him exactly the order of questions I was gonna ask, but I'm already blowing that up on the second question because you said so many things that are really fascinating to me. And I just wanted to ask you, so it sounds like you're saying that there's a way in which human rights discourse, as we see it in the current moment, or as we've seen it, let's say in the 20th century or post 9/11, or however you want to frame it, that it the language itself tends to sort of overlook this, maybe the source of the condition that it purports to be sort of pointing at. Like, we should see this, we should recognize this, but in some way the language itself allows us to, or makes it so that we don't see the actual thing that might be causing that or contributing to it. You're not saying that human rights discourse itself, creates that oversight necessarily, are you? Or are you saying that, I wonder if you can sort of address that issue.
So I'll give you one example from my book, and in one of the chapters I look at specifically at the workers' rights. So what kind of rights are being promoted or fought for in the arena of working, laboring people. And I give the example of the famous Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh, where horrific loss of life. And a lot of human rights language that came out of that event was really about fairness and justice and fair wages, that sort of language. Whereas really what was at stake there was this appalling global commodity supply chain of capitalism, modern capitalism, which creates the conditions and in fact, promotes the conditions for these kinds of horrific tragedies to happen in the first place, right? I mean, the very reason that we can buy all these cheap commodities in the West is precisely because that kind of exploitation goes on in another part of the world. Somebody did a really fascinating research study, for instance, to show that the rate of exploitation of a worker making an iPhone today is 25 times more than a worker in the industrial 19th century England. So just imagine that, so this is, when we talk about fairness in this kind of context, what does that even mean? What level of exploitation is fair, right? So I would say that no, human rights language is not saying that, okay, this is directly the roots of capitalist exploitation, but it's certainly participating in legitimizing it. Of course, we all want fair wages. Of course, it's very important to fight for such things. And I might add at this point that the book is not this sort of very clear binary of, there are good causes and there are bad causes. Every attempt at reforming injustices, addressing injustices is important. If somebody's being paid poorly, if someone's being treated poorly, of course, those questions and problems should be addressed. However, by just saying it's a matter of fairness, ignores the immense cycle of exploitation that creates, this problem in the first place. So, okay, so now you talk about one building collapse, and then maybe you put into place a few changes or regulations. 1 month later, another building will collapse. I mean, that's just the nature of it. That's just the nature of global capitalism, right? The rush to the bottom in terms of profit. You go to where the cheapest labor is. You go to where the worst regulations are. You go to where you have to pay the least amount of taxes. It's a system based on exploitation. And so when we talk about fairness, what really are we talking about? So I guess that would be one way to think about it is in the issue of language, we are so caught up in this idea of what is justice, what is fairness. Often that ignores the fact that there is kind of embedded in this whole question, a system which has to be dismantled. I mean, the only way that fairness can truly exist is if that particular system is completely dismantled and rebuilt. And so that's where I would stand with that particular question.
Is part of the issue that, the language around fairness, and I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but that part of the language around fairness is almost always like local or sort of small scale rather than global and systemic in what it looks at? I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think that's part of what's going on here is that you know, if you just think of, well, that particular building was badly managed and badly maintained, and if only we can you know, make sure that we have a better you know, managers in place, or we carry out repairs, you know, everything will be okay. Well, that's obviously not the case. Everything will not be okay. Um, I mean, it's interesting you talk about the localization of human rights issues, because there's also the reverse is also true, that, and this is something I talk about in the chapter on the question of empowerment when it comes to women's human rights, that one of the things human rights language also does is try to create this sort of normalization of what a liberated subject is. And often that liberated subject is someone who is modern in the context of being able to consume goods, being able to you know, live in a particular way that is tied to a consumer economy, that is tied to a market economy. So, you know, again, an oppressed woman in that language would not just be oppressed through structural patriarchy, but would be oppressed because she has no access to the modern capitalist machinery. And so that's also an interesting contrast, where the local gets affixed to the global as a way to say, okay, if you want to be liberated, then liberation means that you're this sort of transnational subject. And this is one of the things that's become much more evident and you know, sort of post 9/11 in the last 20 years, particularly because of the ways in which digital technology has kind of tried to create this sort of quote unquote Thomas Friedman's infamous flat world, which of course we know is a terrible, terrible, ridiculous assertion. So I think both happens with human rights. One is it stays localized and thus misses the sort of global macroeconomic connections. And then it also tries to make those connections sometimes, but for the wrong reasons, connecting sort of localized oppression to liberation that can only come with the market economy. So often, even with sort of quote unquote closed societies like Iran and North Korea, the problem, yes, is that you know, certain freedoms are denied, but somehow magically those freedoms would come back if only they would be able to, you know, purchase Western commodities, right? And so the commodity element is a vital part of the human rights kind of formulation of liberation. If you cannot buy a commodity, how free are you really? That's the capitalist ethos, right? I mean, if everybody can buy hamburgers and if everybody can buy cereal in a box, so much the better. And so the completely liberated subject in a capitalist economy is one who can consume what is available, and preferably at a marked up price.
Let me take it back then and ask you about you know, the book begins and there's an entire chapter that focuses on the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and can you talk about the importance of that document for your book and in terms of like establishing or defining what human rights discourse even is, and then maybe you could even extend that to talk about why you focus on post 9/11 for the focus of your book. But first, start with the UN.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the foundational document, and even though it's not strictly speaking law, it is the principles around which a lot of human rights work has been done, both by the nation states but also transnationally. But of course, the history of this particular document, which came out in 1948, you know, the shadow of the Cold War is all over it, and so of course, many of this. People who were associated with formulating it, including Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, were very consciously aware of the sort of the real sort of opposition to certain kinds of ways in which they were thinking of human rights. And so the Soviet Union was a very important presence in giving certain rights, but not giving others. So workers' rights were okay as long as they were within the sort of social democratic model, not within the model of abandoning private property and private ownership and anything like that. So there's that whole shadow of the freedom of the individual, which the dignity of the individual, which is something that got enshrined in that document, and it still is in many ways the way in which we think of human rights. So in the West, a dissenting journalist will get much more attention, let's say, than the collective rights of a group of people, for instance, right? We are much more inclined to see the individual being more worthy of rights somehow. The other thing I would say about the Declaration is that it was formulated at a time when there were some real alternatives to what was going on in the world, the status quo of the post-war world. And I would mention just three possible alternatives. One was the Pan-African alternative, the view of the world. One was decolonization movements, many of which were very active at that point. And the third was, of course, the Communist International. And all of these groups were talking about human rights in a very, very significant way. But the UN Declaration was not interested in engaging with this other conversation, because all of these movements were very much located within a struggle against imperialism. And of course, one of the ironies and obvious shortcomings of the UN Declaration is that they're constantly talking about rights, and most of the signing parties at that point in Europe have colonies all over the world, whether it's France and North Africa and Southeast Asia, or Britain, of course, all over Africa, and so on and so forth, and the United States with its territories and so on. So the whole question of self-determination of peoples becomes this horribly ironic, undertext of this document, where they sort of mention it, but then they sort of also put it in the background, because really what the obvious problem is not confronted, and that is that certain powers, many of whom are signing this document and formulating this document, are oppressing millions of people around the world. And so very soon you see, the British doing in Kenya with the Mau Mau rebellion, and the French in Algeria with FLN, and doing the things that they said were human rights violations. This is exactly what the other groups were trying to address. If it's, you read George Padmore, you read Nkrumah, you read Du Bois, this is fundamental to their understanding of human rights, that you cannot separate rights from political and economic matters. And what the UN Declaration was trying to do was sort of walk this very delicate line of acknowledging the problems and the injustice in the world, but trying to remain what in their view was ideologically neutral. And of course, there is no neutrality here. I mean, when it comes to something like imperialism, you either, you take a stand or you don't. And so as far as that is concerned, from the beginning, you have this foundational document that is problematic. For instance, there's no mention of apartheid. 1948 is the same year when apartheid in South Africa becomes official government policy, right? And yet there's no sort of mention of that. It's also the year in which hundreds of Arab villages are depopulated in Palestine. No mention of that, right? So it is a document with all its sort of glorious history and claims and noble aims, is tainted by its inability to deal with real injustices, right? I can keep talking, but you look
I
like
wanted
you're,
to,
yeah.
I just want to ask a question because I think that it's this is a sort of one of the things that people, you know, like if you're a person like me who is just sort of off the street reading your book, I'm going to say that about myself, that you struggle with is that you want to say on one hand, but this is an important document. I mean, this document is so important for, you know, movements to help to free people, liberate people, or whatever, you know, in history across the world. And you're saying that this document is insufficient or is problematic. You're not asking us to sort of throw documents like this out the window, or even um, uh, uh, human rights discourse itself, right? But you're asking us to look more closely at it and to sort of understand the ways in which it is it's fraught by its like political moment or what. Like, can you talk more about that? What your critique of these particular, whether it's a popular culture document, or whether it's a document like the Declaration, which is sort of foundational to the whole thing. How do you see your critique of these particular documents?
Well, I mean, again, go back to my to the person I quote often, Jameson, and say always historicize. I mean, you know, in this case, it's very important to historicize the document, when it came out, how it came out, why it came out, and why a certain kind of language was enshrined in it. So there's a very important reason that the individual gets the kind of attention she gets in this document, precisely because you have the real sort of alternative of communism, which emphasizes the collective, right? Which emphasizes a different kind of reality, which emphasizes, you know, something other than, say, private property and things like that. So unless you historicize a document like that, or any cultural text for that matter, it won't be possible to understand why, for instance, the individual, or quote unquote, the dignity of the individual becomes this kind of normative way in which we think about human rights. It didn't just come from nowhere, right? I mean, why do we not think of human rights in a much more collective way? And then you go from there to the implication of thinking of human rights in a sort of individualistic way, and that is you negate or you erase collective struggle for change. So if the assumption is that human rights are issues that affect individuals and therefore, you know, you fight in a particular way, then real change through revolutionary struggle does not really become an option, because that's not the real subject of sort of rights abuse. It's the individual, right? And so I think that's where context is so important as far as language goes. No language is innocent, as we know. And so where it comes from, how it originates, and how certain things become the norm is vital to our understanding why we need to sort of counter them with alternative languages, right? So I would say that that's a key factor in trying to understand the Declaration, is to really look closely at that particular moment. And 1948 is a moment that, you know, is a sort of world historical moment of change. And I think the real possibility of revolutionary change is still very much alive in the colonies, for instance. Africa is still almost completely colonized. And if you think about many of the radical movements that are coming out of Africa and the Caribbean and South Asia, Southeast Asia in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, you can understand then why there is a fear that the sort of Western liberal capitalist order is under a real threat. So unless we understand human rights language coming out of that particular historical context, we won't understand why it took the shape it did. So that would be my sort of long answer to your question.
How about so briefly, why do you focus on then post 9/11?
So very quickly, post 9/11, I think that language becomes even more sort of sharp because of the quote-unquote war against terror, the rise of surveillance, technology, all of these things. I mean, if you do a search online and you see this huge rise in the volume of books, articles, all kinds of things just shooting up. So it just accelerates to a huge extent. And the other reason I chose it because I think also there is an acceleration of a different kind of issue and a problem, and that is multinational global capitalism. You know, the kind of way in which the financialization of the world is quickened up, leading to the economic crisis of 2008, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a reason that 9/11, even though it's in some ways a localized event, because the United States has this enormous economic and political power, has its ramifications on the rest of the world. And thus, and of course, there's Abu Ghraib, there's, all of that. And so I think, it was a pivotal moment, and it provided a certain lens to look at that specific moment.
Okay, well, so I mean, there's a reason why we are doing this this conversation remotely, right? And I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but I mean, so your book was published last fall before COVID-19, before the world changed. I mean, we're talking about 9/11 as a moment in which the world drastically changed, and of course the UN declaration after World War II, a moment in which the world changed. And now we've got COVID-19, which is changing the world in profound ways right now. I'm wondering if your book was being published like in fall of 2020 instead of having been published in fall of 2019, how would it be different? What would you be talking about in that book, the book published after COVID-19?
Yeah. Well, in the very first page of my book, I have a quotation from Walter Benjamin, where I say that you learn from the tradition of the oppressed that the emergency situation is the state in which the oppressed live. I mean, it's not an aberration; it's the norm. And if anything, we have seen some incredibly sort of pervasive violations of human rights that have come to the forefront in the last few weeks, things that always existed, right? I mean, in a sense, the inequities and injustices which have been sharpened by the pandemic, whether it's the harm that is being caused to the most vulnerable people in our societies, or the kind of lack of protection workers have in our societies, the kind of price immigrant and working class communities are paying. This has always been there. It's just being sharpened and made more transparent to more people, which just shows that I hope that part of what I was trying to do in my book is to demonstrate that just talking about human rights, particularly in the dominant language of rights, is not enough, because it does not show where all of these are coming from. So let's just take the complete failure of an abdication of the healthcare system in the United States, right? And you have to see the various structural problems here, right? It's not just something that came about because of the pandemic. It was always there, and in a crisis like this, it's just sharpened the immense inequities in the system, from the millions of people who don't have access to care to the people who do the work who have very little protection, and so on and so forth. Another example, I mean, even very recently, the city of Detroit is shutting off water to its residents, and this is at a time when we've been told that the most important thing you can do is to constantly wash your hands, right? And this is what we're doing. And of course, again, this has been happening since the last 6-7 years in Detroit. And so it's not just appalling because it's a pandemic, but it's appalling, period. Now, we can talk about it in a number of ways that these are violations of basic rights, you know, and if you look at whether it's housing, employment, clean water, all of these things which are at risk at this particular moment, these are basic human rights, right? This is not something that's negotiable. Access to good healthcare and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, yes, these are basic human rights and people should have access to them, but clearly there's a reason people don't have access to them. You know, if you go back far enough, you see that once you privatize healthcare, make it a system which is meant to generate profit for a few, then this is inevitable, right? In a sense, it's inevitable. I mean, some of the countries that have been relatively successful in controlling the pandemic, whether it's Vietnam, Cuba, Taiwan, places like that, they have a pretty robust public health programs in place where a majority of the population are covered, and so on and so forth. And here we are in the richest country in the world with the highest number of fatalities, which tells you something about the system, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that if I were to, you know, write this book, you know, in coming this fall, I would hopefully be able to connect some of those dots between what I've been saying about the importance of rights, certainly that all of these things I've talked about, whether it's clean water or education or employment, have to be fought for and have to be sort of come to a point where, you know, any person who lives in this society should have access to it. But at the same time, why just talking about these things from the perspective of rights is insufficient, because clearly the problem is a structural one. And unless we go to the root of the problem, you know, post-COVID, we go back to normal, quote unquote. And my point is, the normal is what is the problem. And it has always been a problem for those who are most vulnerable. And it's just now that, you know, you see it more obviously, but it's not a new situation. The precarious positions of frontline workers, the exploitation of large numbers of people, you know, the latest news from Smithfield Pork Factory, where 200 to 300 people have been infected. They were, you know, they had to continue to go to work. You know, they didn't have a choice. Just as the Amazon workers have to go to work who have no choice. So this is nothing new. This has existed for a very long time. And if you want to do something about it, we have to transform the system. Just arguing for, again, fairness will not be enough. Going back to my previous example.
I have 100 questions right now. I'll start with this one. I'm not going to ask 100 because we're about 35 minutes in, but I'm wondering if what do you say to the person who is hearing us talk about your book and you know, concludes that well, this is all fine and good. This is, you know, it's interesting or whatever, but what does this have to do with my actual everyday life? Like, I'm literally, you know, we could talk about, you know, at this moment, I'm stuck in my house and I lost my job and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever it might be is the condition of that person. I mean, because I don't think that you're talking, this is not like a sort of theoretical exercise for you as a writer, as a theorist, as a teacher and scholar. So can you talk about, like, why is this important for the everyday people's lives right now in this moment?
Yeah. So I hope what I do in my book is I offer a method of analysis. I offer a way to see the world, to demystify the world, to open up ways to see particularly in the case of language, what has become normalized? What has become common sense, quote unquote, right? And we've heard a lot of people talk about their gut instincts during this pandemic and how they've acted from their instincts. So how do these things get, how do they get formulated? How do they get enshrined? How do they become wisdom? And likewise, I think in any situation, including the present one, if we can sort of dismantle some of these normative pathways or perspectives that have been set for us, then hopefully we will see that there is the real potential for transformation. I mean, the reality is that when the government wants, it can apparently send people money, without getting bankrupt. It can do all kinds of things. It can free up billions of dollars to give to corporations.
Right.
So why does it have to take a pandemic to do that?
Right.
Clearly there is money to do stuff, but we choose not to do it.
Yeah, it's really interesting, all the talk about, from the right, about how we have to make sure that this doesn't become something that gets enshrined for forever, right? We have to make sure this is just for crisis,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, they know that from the Great Depression, came all kinds of social programs that no American, whatever their political philosophy, is willing to give up on now, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the same fear now, that somehow we will actually have real transformation, which means that Jeff Bezos will not earn the same as several small countries. Mm-hmm. So, and actually several large countries too, I believe. I think that, hopefully someone who is at this point really sees the darkness of the moment and not much hope for the future, will also look around and see the amazing acts of solidarity across the globe, and many, many acts of courage and that people are organizing even during pandemics, and even in the United States, there have been strikes and walkouts, and the healthcare professionals who have come out of the hospitals holding signs, and there's a real recognition that this system cannot work the way it is. It's not sustainable, and it shouldn't take a crisis to realize that. But I hope what in a very small way, a work like mine can accomplish is to say that, okay, here's something that on a very small level, maybe can offer some hope for change. But if we see certain acts of injustice, how should we break it down? How should we address these acts? How should we provide solutions to them? Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that if we can sort of step back and say, yes, it's very important to make sure everybody has clean water, but how do we make sure that, come the next crisis, that the most vulnerable will we not be the first people whose water gets shut off, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. How do we make sure that the undocumented people in this country who are paying billions and billions of dollars in taxes are getting nothing as, for this moment when they may be out of work, homeless, and so on and so forth. We shouldn't have to wait. If we wait for a crisis to fix things, then there'll never be real change, because it'll be okay till the next great disaster. Mm-hmm. So I hope that's what I can contribute in a very small way to thinking about moments that highlight the urgency of what already does exist, mm-hmm. And find a way to work together to address them.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that this is like what we mean when we talk about being, a subject who has a critical engagement with the world that she lives in, right? That mm-hmm. You're talking about a situation in which language, which to us so much of the time seems like something that's in the background and that's unimportant, is actually so important, because it's a thing that's constructing not just our understanding of the reality that we live in, but the actual reality that we live in, right?
Right.
But also you're talking about the ways in which our ability to see and engage that language critically can open up opportunities for us to like change the actual situation that we live in, right?
And to create a new language, and to create a language of change and transformation that is not tied up in all of these kind of uh, ideologies that have been constructed purely for particular kinds of gain. Ideologies that are affixed to uh, you know, privatized forms of care, or, I mean, why is it so hard to imagine a healthcare system that is not based on profit? I mean, that too is an act of the imagination, right? As much as it is an economic possibility, it's an act of the imagination. Why would that seem so unrealistic? Can you imagine somebody now taking away Social Security? It would be unthinkable, right? And if once upon a time that was not the normal way of thinking about, your post-work life. So I hope that alternative realities and alternative languages can be adopted and constructed, always through collective struggle, of course. And I mean, one of the things that this kind of situation gives rise to is people actually seeing how much in common they have with each other, rather than hopefully dividing, which of course the politicians will try their best to do, but we have to fight against that.
I think that's a great place to stop, because it speaks directly to the mission of the Eastside Freedom Library, and we both are big supporters of Eastside Freedom Library and really believe in what it's doing. But I think at its core, it's really trying to bring people together and trying to foster collective action, across sort of various kinds of boundaries, and borders and ways of dividing people to bring people together to fight for justice. So yeah, so we're right on time. And I really want to thank you for having this conversation with me.
I always love talking with you, Todd, and it's a real pleasure. And I really, really do hope we can have this conversation once again with people in the room. And because I know that I certainly don't have all the answers, and the sort of people who come to ESFL will have a lot to say, a lot of contributions, and hopefully, we will be able to engage in a productive, thoughtful way. I really look forward to that possibility.
Well, here's to hoping that things will be, at some point in the future, we'll be able to do that, and things will at least get to some point where we can get together in person. So, all right.
Thanks, Todd.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you for visiting our video. I'm Beth Cleary.
I'm Peter Ratcliffe, and this is Orso, the library dog.
We are the co-founders and co-executive directors of the Eastside Freedom Library in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. If you enjoy our programming and want to support our work, please visit our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org.